Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. In a diplomatic breakthrough, both Israel and Lebanon agreed earlier this month to hold negotiations over the fate of so-called Block 9 of a disputed offshore gas field. The talks will be mediated by the United States and held under United Nations auspices. Hopefully, if deemed successful, some of the tensions between Jerusalem and Beirut will be alleviated. To discuss the anticipated talks, we're joined here in the studio by Dr. Mordechai Nisan, who is a retired lecturer on Middle Eastern Studies at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Eran Lerman, the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute of Strategy and Security and a lecturer at Shalem College. Shalom. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding and update on the latest development pertaining to this topic.
In your introduction, you left out two terms, Hezbollah and Iran. You probably saved the best for last.
Indeed.
And while there are disputes between the two states, Israel and Lebanon, obviously what is looming behind the tensions is the fact that Lebanon is beholden to Hezbollah and Hezbollah is beholden to Iran. Now, Israeli military officials have recently said that there are three basic reasons for the continued state of tension between the countries. One is the so-called Shaba farms, quite a barren mountain between Israel, Syria, and Lebanon.
I'm glad you know where it is because it's a piece of fiction.
It is not really a piece of fiction. I've been there. It is called farms. Mazrat, it's really terrace, or it's barren, yes, of course. And the question is, on the maps, does it belong to Syria or to Lebanon? Israel doesn't say that it belongs to Israel, only that when peace comes, it will return it to whoever is the legitimate owner. But in any event, Hezbollah has seen fit to keep the flame of the so-called Shaba farms alive. The second question has to do with the demarcation of the border between Israel and Lebanon. Again, Israel is within its rights and has been ever since it withdrew from South Lebanon 19 years ago. And the third one is what is happening in the Mediterranean.
Dr. Nisan, how do you perceive the latest developments?
I agree that anything that we say that's relevant regarding Lebanon is connected to Hezbollah and Iran. There's a famous line from Ayatollah Khomeini who said, "Don't insult Islam by calling it a religion of peace." Meaning that anything that Hezbollah does and says is related to the fixed final solution to the Jewish problem according to Hezbollah and Iran, which is the destruction of Israel. Meaning that one has to be aware that this is the goal. What precedes that, like, let's say, negotiations between Israeli and Lebanese negotiating teams regarding the maritime frontiers, has nothing to do with Hezbollah's final purpose and raison d'etre. In respect of which, therefore, one cannot assume that because the Iranian Hezbollah team is interested in, quote, liberating Palestine from Israel, that therefore they would be unwilling to engage in any kind of contacts, direct, indirect, in any way or form. So long as the contacts serve the interests of Lebanon, which means serve the interests of Hezbollah and Iran, then there'll be a willingness on the Lebanese part to make a deal.
So the question rises, Dr. Lerman, as you mentioned, the Sheba farms to be fictitious when we're talking about specifically
in the
farms.
sense that it's well known that this was Syrian territory until somebody needed an excuse to keep on fighting after our unilateral withdrawal in May 2000. You look at old maps, old postcards, old postal stamps. It's very clear that Lebanon never considered this segment to be Lebanese until somebody needed an excuse.
Well, there were different times and different demarcation lines on during the course of history, but my question actually is, are those negotiations even valid when we're hearing, as just Dr. Nisan has mentioned, Iran's very strong influence over Beirut, growing influence over various people within parliament and also people of note, including who used to be their enemies. I'm talking about President Aoun and different people that might not have been in the current Iranian-aligned position as in the past.
Well, we have to look at two separate sets here, because actually the exact demarcation of the blue line and the question of Sheba farms are not likely to be settled for the simple reason that Hezbollah would continue to need an excuse to keep its separate military existence entity within the Lebanese system. Once everything is settled with Israel, why should Hezbollah retain its arms? It should be a part of the Lebanese military under conditions of some kind of stable armistice. So almost the raison d'etre of Hezbollah as a militia with its own arms, much more powerful by several degrees than the Lebanese military and the Lebanese state, has to do with the unresolved problems with Israel. So I'm not very hopeful. What is encouraging in the present situation is an indication of the willingness to separate this set of issues, which will remain, I believe, unresolved because there is no real political will on the other side, from the Bloc 9, or actually the triangular question of the EEZ demarcation. And the reason is very simple. Lebanon is starved for cash. It is among the most catastrophically indebted countries anywhere, certainly in the region. A huge proportion compared to the national product, which is not much anyway. A country with high expectation, high standards of living, and nothing to cover for it. And the hope that they can actually draw some of the sisters, the famous names, the big energy companies to prospect and produce off the shores of Lebanon is driving now, and has been driving. This is not the first time we've tried to negotiate. Before the present effort driven by David Satterfield, there was an effort driven by an American by the name of Amos Hochstein, who was in charge of energy negotiations for the State Department, also running between us and them. There is a willingness, I believe, from what I know, there's a willingness in Israel to compromise for a simple reason. It doesn't matter it's not the legal question. We have a very good claim to the most northern point of the triangle, because this is where Lebanon and Cyprus originally marked their EEZs. But we are willing to concede because this will enable us and the Lebanese to prospect in peace. And once they have an interest, and we have an interest, in drawing the big investing players in, and for us to produce energy without having to worry about protecting our EEZ, our economic zone, from Hezbollah incursions or whatever else may come our way. This is a net economic benefit for both sides. And as Congressman Elliot Engel heard from this anti-Semite, Nabih Berri, Jews are very fond of money. This was a very, very indirect way for Berri and the Lebanese leadership to say, we can cut a deal. War is war and business is business.
Nabih Berri, referring to the Speaker of Parliament, who is also one of the leaders of the alternative Shiite organization in Lebanon, which is also allied with Hezbollah. Mr. Oren, just to make things more simplified for the case of our viewers, we're talking here about two separate situations. One is the offshore dispute pertaining to the Bloc 9, as I initially mentioned in the introduction of this program, and the fact that Israel has vast offshore reservoirs found, significant interest in this offshore energy sector, also pertaining to the fact that the United States also is, not the majority necessarily, but one of the major shareholders in Israel's energy fields. Then we have the Lebanese side, which is more interested on its own areas of exploration, and Israel is, of course, wary of that because Russia, Italy, and France are also very much interested on exploring in those areas and hopefully also finding gas for Lebanon, which, of course, if everybody benefits, there will be less tensions in the air.
Dr. Lerman here is a very prolific writer, so one would expect him to publish soon a title such as Prospects for Peace.
Peace is not in the air.
Yes, but yes,
prosperity, maybe.
Yeah, but prospecting for peace or prospects for peace. In any event, of the 4 confrontation states bordering Israel, if one does not count the Palestinian Authority and Gaza under Hamas, you have Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Historically, Lebanon was the weakest and also most at peace with Israel. It was exactly 50 years ago when Palestinians or armed Palestinian elements were ejected from Jordan and settled in Lebanon, joining the refugees there, that Lebanon became a very active confrontation state, and Israel started having campaigns against the Palestinians and wars in Lebanon because of the Palestinians there. It was only later that the Shiites, first under Amal and Nabi Berri, whom you mentioned, and then Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah, that they became Israel's main enemies and the major influence over Lebanon, especially since Syria had to leave Lebanon 14 years ago. Now, it is very beneficial for Israel to settle with Lebanon this problem, because for Israel, it is good to have something to lose for Lebanon. If Lebanon has such a gas field, which is going to be an important national asset, then Hezbollah will be foolhardy to start anything with Israel, knowing that this asset could be hit by Israel. So in order to get some sort of deterrence, Israel should encourage rather than discourage Lebanese wealth of this gas field.
Dr. Nisan, when we're talking about Lebanon, there are 2 definitions that come to mind. One is Suisse d'Orient, which is the Switzerland of the Mediterranean, termed that way by the French, who were responsible for this country under the mandate following World War I, and its capital, Beirut, as Paris d'Orient. Again, Paris of the Mediterranean, giving it the attributes that it deserves. It's a beautiful country. Nevertheless, after civil wars, crisis after crisis, we see a government failing in really reviving the economy. As Dr. Lerman and Mr. Oren say correctly, Lebanon is embroiled in humongous debt. To what degree can Lebanon come and actually convince Israel that its rights for those territories may actually incentivize it to maintain peace?
You mentioned the founding of Lebanon in 1920, 1926. And those were days, those were decades when Lebanon indeed fulfilled that image and that vision of the Switzerland of the Middle East. I don't think we have to say Switzerland of the Middle East, the Lebanon of the Middle East in its own right. And that
has nothing to do with cheese or watches.
It has to do with wine and, drinking.
The good life.
It's a beautiful country.
And banking.
Go ahead.
Right. And that was the time when the Christians, in particular the Maronite denomination, were dominant in Lebanese society, culture, politics, army, throughout. And over time, the demography of Lebanon changed radically in a way in which the Christian majority has become a Christian minority. The exact percentage today is not known, and there are different estimates, but be that as it may, we're talking about a Lebanon which was pluralistic. It still is pluralistic, ethnically, religiously, with limited government, not totalitarian political regimes as in Arab countries in the region, typically so, in which there's an array of individual freedoms, which more or less still exist in Lebanon, thriving culture in all areas, theater, music, and the like, films. And this was a country which had an air of tantalizing vitality. And that expressed itself also in the economic domain. And all that, not all that, but most of that, unfortunately, has changed into something quite different. And as we're all aware, it's based on the fact that one community, the Shiites, and through their particular organization called Hezbollah, which was virtually established by Iran and has been patronized by Iran and financed by Iran and armed by Iran and supported by Iran in all respects, Hezbollah has become the dominant force in Lebanon. This in disregard of UN resolutions and the Lebanese so-called Taif Accord of 1989, whereby there were to be no armed militias in Lebanon, and that only the national army would be, as it were, the protector of the nation. Mm-hmm. Today, when we talk about the maritime territorial dispute, it fits that Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, he threatens Israel. You don't need only the foreign minister, or the defense minister, or the president, or prime minister. He himself, Nasrallah, threatens Israel if Israel dares to encroach upon what he considers to be, or the Lebanese consider to be, their maritime territory for drilling. And that's sufficient to know that Lebanon is not a free country. It was under Syrian occupation, today far less so, but it's under Iranian hegemonic control via Hezbollah. And therefore, I don't think one should give much credit if indeed these negotiations take place regarding fixing the maritime border and the like, and if they're successful and they lead to some kind of a reduction of tension between Israel and Lebanon, I don't see that that has any carryover effect regarding the fundamental condition that Israel and Lebanon are at war via Hezbollah's aggressive, arrogant behavior.
To what degree do you think that Hezbollah is actually supportive of such an endeavor of negotiating now with
I can only
Israel?
assume they're in favor because it serves their interests. You know, I mentioned Islam earlier. According to Islam, whatever serves the interests of Muslims is okay. It's kosher, you do it. Don't get bogged down sometimes in doctrine. If, in practical terms, it serves interest, it serves Lebanon's interest.
In this context,
As
halal
Salam
rather than
pointed out,
kosher?
regarding financial gains.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, I'd like to ask you with regard to a post, actually, that Hezbollah made several months ago, and it's a repeated post, of course, where it showed Israel's Leviathan and Tamar gas, offshore gas fields, and during that time, it showed it within the crosshairs of scope, saying in the background that if Israel dare attack Lebanon, the offshore gas fields will not stay safe. To what degree can Israel accept then a situation where there is a maritime border rather than a buffer zone that will protect its crucial energy needs?
Well, what will be the actual parameters agreed and how we slice the triangle is open to negotiation. There could be a buffer zone. There could be there could be arrangements under which there will be some kind of international presence. In any case, Hezbollah was trying to make it look as if the Israeli willingness to negotiate flows from Israel submitting to their threats. That's not exactly what happened. What happened was that Israel has made the proposal years ago. And there was no governmental authority in Lebanon capable of responding because Lebanon was for many years in total political disarray. There was no president. There was, for a very long while, there were tensions within the ruling elite. There was no understanding within the various factions, the Maronites, the Christians, Maronite Christians, the Sunnis, the Shiites, how to actually carve the future income from the skin of the bear that was not yet been hunted. But once there is now in Lebanon a government that we don't like, but it is sort of functional, we could settle down to talk about things that would be beneficial to both sides. So we're not submitting to threats. We are basically just looking at a win-win situation. By the way, it's a win-win-win because we have to take into account we have a third neighbor, and a neighbor for whom we care and with whom we share quite a number of mutual interests, and that's Cyprus, the other partner in the triangle, and the Cypriots behind the scenes have had their own channels.
Talking about the Cypriot
Lebanon.
specifically, do you think that Turkey, which is also quite, considering the fact that it controls a part of Cyprus and has also a stake in certain areas of the Mediterranean close to the disputed territory, do you believe that they have also somewhat of a claim or an interest in somewhat influencing the situation? Consider also that Turkey now has a growing interest and influence within Beirut.
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch how the Turks play the game, because they have been quite aggressive vis-a-vis prospecting in the Cypriot EEZ, claiming that no prospecting will go ahead until the rights of the northern part of what they call the TRNC, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, will be secured in agreement. But I think there's a limit beyond which Turkey would be very careful to push against something negotiated under the aegis of the United Nations and the United States. They already are in a bad quarrel with the Trump administration over the S-400s and the F-35s. Trump has not been shy about threatening the future of the Turkish economy if the Turks get too difficult to manage. And that's one thing that Erdogan has to take into account. He can be very arrogant on all things but the Turkish economy. That could be his undoing. And he responded quite quickly to this threat. So I think they will make rumbling noises that we shall have to take into account, but they will not dare actually disrupt an agreement if it is reached.
Mr. Oren, despite the Iranian influence in Lebanon, and taking into account the interests of the United States, both in Israel and in its northern neighbor, Lebanon, and its investments, both in the Lebanese armed forces and the Israel armed forces, to what degree do you think that the United States will be able to establish a situation in which it will provide the assurances, both physically and financially, for a normalization of relations between the two countries, if that's even possible?
Under President Trump, the United States is not too keen on enlarging its commitments around the globe. It never had a security pact with Israel, always saying, well, you don't need it. You know that we will come to your help or even your rescue if necessary. While go.
But that policy preceded the Trump administration.
No, well, why go through the motions of it must involve legislation, it's a treaty. So we may see, in effect, such an assurance, but it will not have any binding form. However, energy, the supply of energy from the wells or the drilling before that, through the supply, the pipelines and all, is notoriously vulnerable to attack. But this is true all around. Iranian energy assets are as vulnerable, perhaps even more, than Western ones, Israeli ones, American ones. So there is some sort of balance of terror regarding that. But what one should consider as unfortunate is the fact that the Eastern Mediterranean has not thrived as an issue. You have two fora. You have the Barcelona process of the EU, which started during the heyday of the Oslo process, and you have the Mediterranean dialogue of NATO. And in the Mediterranean dialogue, you have Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and 4 North African countries. If Lebanon could be added to this forum, and if it could be persuaded, even though it doesn't have peace with Israel, to take part in such a peaceful conversation, it would help a lot, and the same goes for the Barcelona process.
Well, we're actually drawing...
I should mention that in January this year, there was quite a singular event in Cairo establishing the EMGF, the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which is essentially a 3+3.5 arrangement. It's Italy, Greece, Cyprus on the European side. It's Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority. So you're having something in the Eastern Mediterranean which resembles the 5+5 in the Western Mediterranean. There are a number of things in motion in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you a chance to actually provide an assessment. Are we heading to a resolution or not? Dr. Nisan?
In my understanding, the major concern of Hezbollah, among other concerns, is the fact that it must try and develop its own Lebanese identity. It's charged with being a proxy of Iran, which it certainly is. Its Arab credentials are somewhat suspect because the Arab world, most of it, is opposed to Hezbollah because of its relationship with Iran. So the important point for Hezbollah at times is the Lebanonization of Hezbollah. And in order that they show their identity as being committed to Lebanon, therefore they will support these negotiations with Israel because it will bring benefit to Lebanon.
Dr. Lerman?
In addition, we have to bear in mind the pressure that the Trump administration is bringing to bear on Iran has led clearly to a cutoff, significant cutoff, in the flow of funds to Hezbollah. We see the interest of Hezbollah in taking over ministries of government in Lebanon, which in the past they shied away from because they need the money, they need the jobs, they need to pay their people. So the pressure is on them right now.
The Americans are heavily sponsoring the Lebanese National Army and the security service. Hopefully, they will balance out the Hezbollah organization. But the more positive indication is that for the last 13 years, there has been no conflagration between Israel and Lebanon.
And hopefully it will remain so. This is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank Dr. Nisan, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Lerman for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.